I'm Maddie, I'm your host, and this is That Girl Is Gone.
Artlist.io.
I have not been completely honest. In the first episode of this podcast, I told you guys the story of the bluebird and how it, set me on the trajectory to get me where I am now. But that was only half the story, and it's not where it started. It started long before that. But that story is really freaking close to my heart. And I haven't wanted to tell it. And I've known that the reason that I've had such a hard time recording this podcast is because this podcast can't exist without telling that story. And we're 25 seconds in and I'm already tearing up, so that's going to be a major theme. I cry at the drop of a hat. But yeah, I've had a lot of resistance around recording this podcast because I haven't wanted to really get into what That Girl Is Gone means to me, where I came up with the name, what actually started the whole thing. Mostly because it's a love story, and I don't know. It's hard to talk about how you feel. It's hard to talk about loving someone, especially when you're afraid nobody's going to understand it. But last night, I decided that it's a story that needs to be told, so buckle up, here we go. In 2019, I met a boy on Tinder. For the sake of his privacy, we're going to call him Strudel throughout this podcast. So I met Strudel in 2019 on Tinder. He messaged me and I didn't reply. And then he messaged me again and I didn't reply. And then he messaged me like 3 more times. And eventually I replied after like a month of him trying to reach out. And he invited me over to hang out in his hot tub and have a couple drinks. And I was going to go, and then another boy I had been talking to at the time asked me to hang out that night. So I ditched Strudel and I went and hung out with the other boy. And so Strudel ups the ante to a beach weekend at his condo in New Smyrna. And obviously I'm not going to say no to that. But it's also the weekend that I'm moving out of the apartment I currently lived in with my ex-boyfriend at the time. And it was like the week before I had to go on a bachelor party. So I was like supposed to be moving out of this apartment, and the day that I needed to be out of the apartment was the day that I was leaving for a bachelor party. And the weekend right before that is the weekend that I met Strudel in New Smyrna. And even the first night, like, I actually replied to him and we talked. I don't know. I felt something different, and honestly, as crazy as it sounds, I felt like he could be the person that I spent the rest of my life with. He was so in his ego at the time, trying to impress me. It makes me giggle now, because I didn't recognize it then, or I kind of did, but not really. Anyways, so I always kind of battled with, like, whether I was just falling into the trap of, like, him talking himself up, or if I really just had this little inkling, The night that I'm going to meet him in New Smyrna, I stopped at the Wendy's outside of my apartment complex, and as I'm leaving the Wendy's, like, to get food, I don't know if that was obvious. As I'm leaving the Wendy's, I get this weird nudge that he's going to have a weird voice. And I really didn't even know what that meant. And then he calls me, like literally 30 seconds later, he calls me. And his voice is like kind of, it's not like weird. It was just maybe like higher pitched than I expected, or I don't know. It was just, it was different, but I like recognized it. And mind you, I've like never talked to this man before, never met him. That was the first time I had an intuitive nudge about Strudel, or maybe the second time. So I get to New Smyrna, and obviously I'm going to leave some details out of these stories, but we ended up going to a bar called Traders. We went to a couple different bars, but I remember being at Traders, and honestly, he was not nice to me, and I could tell that it was because he had been hurt. Like, he just had this huge wall up, and back then, my mission was to tear down any walls of vulnerability anybody else had, because I wanted to dive into the depths of other people, but I had all these walls up myself, and that's, a whole another tangent. But basically, Strudel was a fuck boy, honestly, and in hindsight, after that first weekend, I should have never spoke to him again. God, if I had any freaking like self-worth back then, I would have walked away. But I didn't. I saw it as a cause worth fighting for, and I don't know, I could just tell that like who he was projecting wasn't really him. And so back to the actual story, we're at this bar called Traders, and there's a live band playing, and we go like sit over by where the like band has their stage kind of thing. And I don't remember if the lady was already dancing or if she was sitting, but Strudel got up and went over to this woman. She had to have been like somewhere between her 40s and 60s. I don't remember exactly. But he started dancing with her, and it was just the sweetest thing I'd ever seen. And I don't know, just confidence and boldness and the playfulness was like foreign to me in a man. I had just gotten out of a relationship with somebody who was the literal opposite of that, and Strudel, I don't know. He was the opposite of everything my ex was, and I wanted it. I wanted to be with someone bold and playful and fun and who wasn't afraid to be themselves, and that's kind of the outward projection that Strudel gave. And he said something sweet and charming to the lady about how beautiful she was or something, and God, I don't even know if I've ever told him this story. But I just remember thinking, damn, I could marry that man. And mind you, I've known him for like a couple hours, like in person at this point, So part of that is just like my own delulu, insecure brain. But it was deeper than that, and I could feel it. And so we spend the weekend together, and I go home and move into my new apartment, and Strudel, continues to show a lot of interest in me, and now I don't know if he knows it. I mean, in hindsight, I was definitely being love bombed, like quote unquote love bombed, but I not from like a narcissistic, like, we were just both in our egos, and he had been in a long-term relationship that also, I think, shattered his heart. I don't know if that's how he would describe it. I've got to stop saying that. This is like my podcast, right? So, and that's part of the reason I've had such a hard time telling this story, because it's not just mine. And sometimes I feel like it's not totally my story to tell, or that I'm gonna, step on his privacy, or I don't know, just all that bullshit. But anyways, I went back to my life. He went back to his life. That month, I got a new job and moved into a new apartment. He got a new job and moved into an apartment in Fort Lauderdale. And that's the other thing. There were all these synchronicities. Like, his name is the same as my grandpa's name, and my grandpa died of Alzheimer's, and he worked on the Alzheimer's Association. And like I said, the voice thing earlier. And I don't know. I've always been a pretty intuitive person, and it was just like hitting me like a freight train, all of these things. I didn't really know how to make sense of them. Besides, I knew he was supposed to be in my life. And I was super insecure back then. And I didn't know how to approach things from a detached perspective. And I got really clingy. And the clingier I got, the further he walked in the other direction. But it was like he was always looking back at me, and I was always looking forward towards him. And fast forward 4 years later, and we still have not figured out how to meet in the middle. But meeting him woke me up. I am not the same person I was the weekend I met him. And that's where the title "That Girl Is Gone" really came from. I fell in love with him, and it taught me how to love myself. And the version of me who hated myself, who had no boundaries and no self-respect, no self-worth, and didn't know how to approach anything from a balanced standpoint. Suddenly that girl started to not serve me anymore, and that girl felt too small for where I was going, because meeting this boy made me feel like the world was my oyster and anything I wanted I could have. I had been living in such a lack mentality, and he felt bigger than life, and I knew that if I ever wanted to be with him, that I was going to have to let go of all of my outdated beliefs about what was possible for me. So much has transpired between us in the last 4 years, and I've grown into somebody that I never thought I'd be. And I know that I am the reason that happened, but he was the catalyst. And I'm not really sure how I'm going to approach telling these stories yet, but I've got 4 years worth of love lessons to give, and I don't want to sit on them anymore simply because I'm afraid of looking stupid. So, stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about boundaries and how boundaries can absolutely change the dynamic of relationship.